I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a kid at 17 was getting grounded or failing a class. Turns out I was wrong. The worst thing that can happen is watching a police officer take notes while your stepdad calmly explains how you tampered with his brakes, and your own mother nods along like she's finally been proven right about you. I'm Elliot, and I was 17 when my life split cleanly into a before and an after. Before all of this, my family situation already felt fragile, like one wrong word could knock the whole thing over. My biological dad left when I was 9. No big dramatic exit. No screaming matches that I remember. He just stopped showing up, stopped calling, and eventually stopped existing in any way that mattered. For a long time, it was just me and my mom. We struggled, sure, but there was warmth. I was the kid who did dishes without being asked, who tried to keep things calm because I could see how tired she was. Then she met Mark. Mark came into our lives when I was 13. He had that confident, self-assured energy that adults mistake for stability. He worked with cars, owned his own small repair shop, and talked like a man who believed he had life figured out. He brought expensive wine to dinner, fixed things around the house without being asked, and called my mom babe in this casual way that made it sound like he'd been there forever. Everyone told her she was lucky. I told myself the same thing. At first, Mark was polite to me in that distant, overly formal way. He'd ask about school, nod at my answers, and then turn back to my mom as if the conversation had ended naturally. Over time, that politeness cooled into something sharper. Comments about how I slept too late. Jokes about how kids these days were lazy. Little digs disguised as advice. If you applied yourself, Elliot, you could actually be something. Stuff like that. My mom started repeating his words, almost verbatim. If I forgot to take the trash out, it wasn't just a mistake anymore, it was a pattern. If I stayed up late studying or just trying to escape into music, it became that attitude again. I learned pretty quickly that disagreeing only made things worse. So I kept my head down. I focused on school. I stayed out of his way. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy reminding me that it was his house now, even though my mom technically owned it. He'd talk loudly about bills he paid, repairs he handled, sacrifices he made. Always just loud enough for me to hear from the other room. Always with that edge that said I was ungrateful for even existing there. The first real crack showed up about a year before everything exploded. I had borrowed one of Mark's tools without asking. A simple mistake. I needed a wrench for a school project and thought I'd put it right back. I did put it back. But when he couldn't find it immediately, he accused me of stealing. Not borrowing. Stealing. He stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, staring at me like he'd already made up his mind. When I tried to explain, my mom cut me off. She sighed, rubbed her temples, and said, Elliot, I've seen this side of you before. Just be honest. That sentence stuck with me. Seen this side of you before. As if I'd been hiding something dark and ugly all along. After that, everything I did felt like it was being watched. Mark started locking his toolbox. He'd make a show of counting cash from the register at his shop when I was around. Once, when a small amount of money went missing from his jacket pocket, he didn't accuse me outright, but he didn't have to. He just looked at me, then at my mom, and shook his head slowly. She didn't say a word. By the time I turned 17, I felt like a guest in my own home. A suspicious one. I spent more time out of the house, working part-time, studying at the library, finding any excuse not to be there. I thought distance might calm things down. I thought if I stayed invisible long enough, the tension would fade. It didn't. Mark had this old sedan he was obsessed with. He talked about it the way some people talk about their children. He spent weekends under the hood, tweaking things that didn't need fixing, polishing it even when it was already clean. That car was his pride. His proof that he was competent, skilled, in control. The day before everything went wrong, I remember him working on it in the driveway. I remember because I deliberately stayed inside, headphones on, door closed, trying not to exist. At dinner that night, he was quiet. Too quiet. My mom asked if something was wrong, and he just said he was tired. The next morning, I woke up to shouting. Not the usual annoyed comments or passive-aggressive remarks. Full-on shouting. My name being yelled like an accusation. I came out of my room to find Mark standing in the hallway, face red, eyes locked on me like I'd committed some unforgivable crime. My mom stood behind him, arms folded tightly across her chest. He didn't ease into it. He didn't ask questions. He said, "What did you do to my car?" I laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because it sounded so absurd. I told him I hadn't touched it, that I hadn't even been outside. He stepped closer, invading my space, and said he knew sabotage when he saw it. He said the brakes had been messed with, that someone could have gotten hurt, that only someone with a grudge would do something like that. I looked at my mom, waiting for her to say something, to step in, to tell him he was being ridiculous. Instead, she said it again. That same sentence. Calm, disappointed, final. Elliot, I've seen this side of you before. My stomach dropped. I tried to explain. I reminded them I hadn't been near the car. I told them I'd been inside all evening. Mark smirked and said I was good at playing innocent. He said he'd already talked to someone who confirmed the damage wasn't an accident. When he said he was calling the police, I thought he was bluffing. I thought this was just another scare tactic, another way to put me in my place. Then the doorbell rang. 2 officers stood on our porch, notebooks out, expressions neutral. Mark invited them in like honored guests. He told his story slowly, confidently, pointing at me as if I were a piece of evidence myself. When they asked my mom what she thought, she didn't hesitate. She said she supported her husband. She said she believed him. I stood there, 17 years old, realizing that in their eyes, I was already guilty. And as one of the officers turned toward me and asked me to explain my side, Mark met my gaze and smiled in a way I'd never seen before. Not angry, not smug, certain. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just an argument anymore. This was something else entirely. And it was only just beginning. The officers didn't arrest me that day. Not immediately. That almost made it worse. They took notes, asked questions, glanced between Mark and me like we were 2 versions of the same story, and they hadn't decided which one sounded more believable yet. Mark stayed calm the entire time. He spoke clearly, never raised his voice, even joked once about how kids these days get angry when you set boundaries. My mom hovered near him, nodding, arms wrapped around herself like she was bracing against disappointment rather than defending her own kid. When they finally left, one of the officers told Mark they'd be in touch, that there would likely be follow-up questions, that they'd want to inspect the car more thoroughly. He thanked them, shook their hands, and closed the door behind them with this satisfied little exhale. Then he turned to me. I don't remember exactly what he said first. I remember the feeling more than the words. The sense that the air in the house had changed, that something had snapped into place, and I was suddenly on the wrong side of it. He told me to go to my room. Not angrily, casually, like he was grounding a child who'd broken curfew, not accusing one of attempted sabotage. My mom didn't look at me as I walked away. From that day on, I wasn't just unwelcome in the house. I was a liability. Mark stopped pretending. He told me I wasn't allowed near his things. He made a point of locking doors behind him. He told my mom, loudly, that he didn't feel safe leaving valuables around anymore. Once, when I came home from work, he was sitting at the table with a notepad, going through a list of expenses. He asked me how much money I made that week and whether I'd be willing to contribute, since I was clearly capable of causing expensive problems. I was still a minor. That didn't seem to matter. My mom started treating me differently too. Not openly cruel, just colder. She watched me the way you watch someone you no longer trust. If I went out, she asked where I was going and when I'd be back, then wrote it down. If I came home later than expected, she'd already be sitting on the couch, waiting. Not worried. Suspicious. Every conversation felt like a test I was destined to fail. I tried everything I could think of to prove I wasn't the person they were turning me into. I showed them my work schedule. I left my phone on the table when I went to shower, hoping they'd see I had nothing to hide. I offered to help around the house more. None of it mattered. Once the idea of who I was had taken root in Mark's head, every action became proof. If I stayed quiet, I was sulking. If I spoke up, I was defensive. If I laughed at something, I was mocking them. If I cried, I was manipulating. A week after the police visit, Mark announced that the car had been fully inspected by someone who knew what they were doing. He said the damage was intentional. He said the mechanic had confirmed it couldn't have happened on its own. He didn't show me the report. He didn't need to. He just looked at my mom and said, "See? I told you." She didn't argue. She didn't even ask to see it. That night, she came into my room while I was lying on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how my life had become a courtroom where I never got to speak. She sat on the edge of the mattress and told me she was disappointed. Not angry, disappointed. She said she felt like she didn't know me anymore. She said she'd ignored red flags for too long because she wanted to believe the best about her son. I asked her what red flags. She said my attitude, my distance, the way I always seemed resentful of Mark, the way I didn't try harder to be a family. I asked her why she never asked why I was distant, why she never wondered what it felt like to be treated like a guest in my own home. She told me I was being dramatic. She said Mark had given us stability, that he'd stepped up when my real father hadn't, that I should be grateful. That word again, grateful. A few days later, the school called her. Apparently, Mark had contacted them. He told them there were concerns about my behavior at home, that there might be legal issues coming up, that it would be wise for them to keep an eye on me. I found out because my guidance counselor pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay at home, in that careful tone adults use when they think you might be dangerous or unstable. I felt something harden in my chest then. Not anger exactly, something colder. From that point on, Mark's control escalated fast. He imposed a curfew, took my house key for now, said it was temporary until things were resolved. I had to knock to get inside my own house. Sometimes he made me wait, just long enough to make a point. He started searching my room while I was at work. I knew because things weren't where I left them. Drawers slightly open, papers shuffled. Once, he confronted me about a notebook where I'd written down lyrics and random thoughts. He said it proved I was unstable. My mom backed him up, saying maybe I should talk to someone. They weren't trying to help me. They were building a case. The second police visit happened on a Thursday evening. This time, they asked to speak to me alone. Mark sat at the table, listening from the next room. I answered every question carefully, aware that one wrong word could confirm everything he wanted them to believe. When they left, one of the officers gave me a look that was almost apologetic. That night, I overheard Mark and my mom talking in their bedroom. I wasn't trying to listen. Their voices carried. He was saying he couldn't live like this anymore, that he was worried about what I might do next, that if something happened to the car again, or worse, it would be on her conscience. He said maybe I needed consequences. Real ones. My mom cried. She said she didn't know what to do. He told her he did. The next morning, she told me to pack a bag. She said it was just for a few days, that Mark needed space, that it would help everyone calm down. I asked where I was supposed to go. She said maybe my aunt, maybe a friend. She didn't offer to call anyone. She didn't offer to help me explain. I asked her if she believed I sabotaged the car. She didn't answer. She just said, I've seen this side of you before. I left the house with a backpack and the understanding that something fundamental had broken. I stayed with a friend's family at first, then with my aunt, who asked questions my mom never had. When she called my mom to get her side, the story she was told was not the one I remembered living. According to Mark, I was volatile, unpredictable, capable of cruelty when cornered. According to my mom, she was scared for everyone's safety. I was 17. I went to school. I worked weekends. I barely raised my voice. The real breaking point came 2 weeks later. Mark officially pressed charges. I found out when a letter arrived at my aunt's house, addressed to me. It stated that I was being accused of criminal mischief and endangerment, that there would be a hearing, that statements would be reviewed, that evidence would be presented. Evidence. My aunt was furious. She called my mom immediately. I heard the entire conversation from the hallway. My mom sounded tired, defensive. She said Mark had no choice, that the car damage was serious, that the police advised him to move forward. When my aunt asked if she'd even considered that Mark might be wrong, there was a long pause. Then my mom said something I will never forget. She said, even if he didn't do it, this might teach him something he clearly hasn't learned. That was it. That was the moment something inside me finally gave up on being understood. But the worst betrayal hadn't happened yet. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. In preparation, Mark provided documentation, statements, expert opinions. And then, during a meeting with a court-appointed mediator, something slipped. A detail Mark didn't realize contradicted his own timeline. Because according to the inspection records he submitted, the car had been worked on again. Not by me. Not by a mechanic. By Mark himself. On a day when I wasn't even in the house. I noticed it because the date jumped out at me. I stared at the paper, heart pounding, realizing that if I was right, everything changed. I brought it up quietly, asked for clarification. Mark's expression shifted, just for a second, and my mom, sitting beside him, turned to look at him in a way I'd never seen before. That was when I knew the truth was closer than it had ever been. After that meeting, Everything slowed down and sped up at the same time. On paper, the process crawled. Dates got pushed. Documents went back and forth. Adults in offices discussed my life using words like allegation and risk assessment. But internally, I was in free fall. The illusion that this was some big misunderstanding, something that would clear itself up if I just stayed calm and honest, finally shattered. I stopped being a kid waiting to be believed. I became a problem that needed to be managed. The charges didn't get dropped right away. The mediator didn't accuse Mark of anything outright. All they did was flag the inconsistency and request additional clarification. That was enough to change the tone, but not enough to stop the damage already done. My school found out. My employer found out, quietly, through one of those concerned adult phone calls. Suddenly, I was being watched everywhere I went. I lost my job 2 weeks later. They told me it was a scheduling issue. They wouldn't meet my eyes when they said it. That was rock bottom. Or at least, the first version of it. I was living out of my aunt's spare room, sleeping on an air mattress that slowly leaked through the night. I'd wake up every morning with my back aching and my phone buzzing with reminders of deadlines, meetings, and a future that felt like it was slipping further out of reach every day. I stopped hanging out with friends because I didn't know how to explain what was happening without sounding unhinged. I stopped talking much at all. There were days I genuinely wondered if Mark had succeeded. Not legally yet, but emotionally. If he'd managed to turn me into the person everyone already assumed I was. My aunt became my anchor, even though I don't think she realized it at first. She didn't hover. She didn't push. She just treated me like a human being. She asked what I needed. Sometimes the answer was food. Sometimes it was silence. Sometimes it was just someone sitting in the same room while I tried not to drown in my own thoughts. One night, after I'd been staring at the same wall for hours, she knocked and came in with 2 mugs of tea. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She said, "This isn't the end of you, but it will be the part you remember later." That sentence stuck. The legal process dragged on, but something important shifted behind the scenes. The inconsistency I'd noticed didn't go away. It got bigger. Dates didn't line up. Mark's statements started to sound rehearsed, overly polished. When asked to explain specific details, he deflected. When asked to provide raw data instead of summaries, he stalled. I wasn't the one pushing any of that. I didn't have the power. I didn't even have a lawyer yet. But the truth has this annoying habit of surfacing when someone keeps poking at it, and Mark had already poked too much. Still, none of that fixed my life in the moment. I had no job, no real home, and a reputation I hadn't earned. Some nights, I'd lie awake replaying everything, wondering where it all went wrong, wondering if there was some version of me that really was broken in a way I couldn't see. That kind of doubt gets under your skin if you let it. The turning point didn't come with a big revelation or a dramatic win. It came quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon, when my aunt handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a list of community resources, legal aid clinics, youth employment programs, counseling services. She told me she wasn't trying to fix things for me. She just didn't want me standing still while everyone else decided my future. So I started moving. I met with a legal aid attorney who listened. Actually listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't assume. When I showed them the documents, their eyebrows went up. They told me not to get my hopes up too high, but they also didn't sugarcoat it. They said there were holes. Real ones. That was the first time someone with authority didn't talk to me like I was a ticking time bomb. I enrolled in a short certification course at a local community center. Nothing glamorous. Just something practical. Something Mark had always mocked as pointless. I studied at night, worked odd gigs during the day, helped my aunt around the house to earn my keep. It wasn't a comeback. It was survival. But survival adds up. Week by week, I started feeling steadier. Not happier, exactly, but less hollow. I stopped obsessively checking my phone for bad news. I stopped flinching every time I saw a car like Mark's on the street. I even laughed once, unexpectedly, at something dumb on TV, and realized it had been weeks since I'd done that. My mom didn't reach out during this time. Not once. I heard things secondhand. That she was stressed. That Mark was angry. That money was tight because of legal fees. That he was telling people he was being targeted unfairly. That he felt betrayed. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. About 3 months in, the charges were officially put on hold pending further investigation. Not dropped. Not dismissed. Just paused. It was enough for my legal aid attorney to advise patience. It was enough for my school to quietly stop treating me like a liability. It was enough for one employer to take a chance on me, part-time, under the table at first. That job changed more than my bank balance. It gave me routine, a reason to get up, a place where I was judged on what I did, not what someone said I might be capable of. I worked hard, harder than I ever had before, not to prove anything to Mark or my mom, but because I needed to prove it to myself. Slowly, people started trusting me again. And then, just as I was starting to feel like I could breathe, my mom called. I stared at the phone for a long time before answering. When I finally did, her voice sounded different, quieter, careful. She asked how I was doing, like she didn't already know the answer might hurt. She said things had been hard, that Mark was under a lot of pressure, that the situation had gotten out of hand. She didn't apologize. She said she missed me. She said she wanted to reconnect. She said she hoped, someday, we could be a family again. I told her I needed time. After I hung up, I realized something that scared me more than the charges ever had. I didn't feel relief. I felt clarity. I saw how quickly she'd chosen comfort over truth, how easily she'd justified sacrificing me for peace. That was when the rebuilding stopped being just about survival. It became about boundaries. Because as the investigation quietly continued, as Mark's story grew thinner, and as my own life started to take shape without them in it, I began to understand something important. If the truth fully came out, it wouldn't just change my future. It would destroy the story they'd built to protect themselves. The investigation was still technically ongoing, but the tone had changed completely. I could feel it in the questions that came through my attorney, in the emails that used to sound suspicious and now sounded procedural. Mark was no longer the calm, wronged victim. He was defensive, evasive, irritated that people kept asking him to explain things he thought he'd already settled. And the more pressure he felt, the more he talked. That was the first crack I learned to exploit. I wasn't actively scheming at first. Not consciously. I was focused on building my life. Working longer hours, finishing my certification, saving money, proving to myself that I could stand without them. But when you've spent months being treated like a criminal, you start noticing patterns. You listen more carefully. You stop giving people the benefit of the doubt and start taking notes instead. Mark liked to talk, especially when he felt cornered. Through mutual acquaintances and family friends, bits of information started drifting back to me. Complaints about the investigation, rants about how people don't understand cars, and paper pushers think they know better than mechanics. He told the same story over and over, but the details shifted depending on who he was talking to. One version had the damage happening late at night. Another had it happening early in the morning. In one story, he noticed it immediately. In another, he didn't realize until days later. Small inconsistencies, harmless on their own, damaging when stacked together. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't confront him. I just listened. My aunt noticed the shift in me before I did. One evening, while we were washing dishes, she asked why I looked so focused all the time. Not stressed. Focused. I told her I was tired of feeling like the only honest person in a room full of liars. She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant and said something I still hear in my head. Then stop acting like you're the one on trial. That was the moment I stopped waiting for justice to happen to me and started positioning myself for when it did. I met with my attorney again and asked very specific questions, not emotional ones, practical ones. What kind of evidence mattered most? What kind of testimony carried weight? What happened if a complainant's credibility fell apart? They didn't give me a roadmap, but they gave me boundaries. And within those boundaries, I realized just how exposed Mark really was. Because the car wasn't the only thing he'd ever lied about. I started reaching out to people from his shop. Not aggressively. Casually. Former employees. A supplier who'd stopped working with him. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't even mention my case. I asked neutral questions. What was he like to work for? Did he keep good records? Was he careful? Honest? The answers weren't flattering. One former employee told me Mark had a habit of fixing problems he created himself. Another mentioned he hated outside inspections because they slowed things down. Someone else casually mentioned that Mark often worked on his own car late at night, even when there was no reason to. I documented everything. Dates, names, exact wording. I didn't share it yet. I didn't even tell my attorney everything I was gathering. I just made sure nothing existed only in my head anymore. Meanwhile, my mom kept calling. At first, it was once every couple of weeks. Then once a week. Always the same pattern. She'd ask how I was doing. She'd tell me she was proud of how mature I'd become. She'd say Mark was under a lot of stress, but that he still wished things had gone differently. She never said he was wrong. She never said she was sorry. I realized something uncomfortable during one of those calls. She wasn't reaching out because she believed me now. She was reaching out because she was scared. Scared of what would happen if the truth fully surfaced. Scared of what it would say about her choices. Scared of being on the wrong side of the story once it was no longer private. That fear gave me leverage I hadn't expected. I stopped answering immediately. I let calls go to voicemail. When I did respond, I was calm, polite, distant. I told her I needed space, that I was focusing on my future, that I wasn't ready to talk about the past. It drove her crazy. She started offering things. Help with school, money, a place to stay if I ever needed it. Each offer came with an unspoken request. Please don't burn this down. I didn't accept anything, but I didn't shut her down either. At the same time, the investigation reached a critical phase. The mediator requested a full timeline reconstruction. That meant everyone had to resubmit statements. Under oath this time. No casual summaries. No vague recollections. Specific dates. Specific actions. Specific reasons. Mark panicked. I heard about it from 3 different people in 2 days. He was angry, snapping at customers, complaining that people were turning on him. He called my mom at work more than once, demanding reassurance, demanding loyalty. That behavior mattered more than he realized. Because when pressure hits, people reveal who they really are. I submitted my statement calmly. Factually, I attached supporting documentation, work schedules, messages, witnesses who could confirm where I was and when. I didn't accuse Mark directly of framing me. I didn't need to. I just laid out the truth and let the contradictions speak for themselves. Behind the scenes, my attorney started connecting dots I hadn't even pointed out yet. Patterns in Mark's repairs, gaps in his explanations, the fact that his own documentation contradicted his earliest claims. Each piece alone was explainable. Together, they painted a picture he couldn't talk his way out of. And then came the opportunity one hadn't planned for. One of Mark's former employees agreed to speak formally. Not about me. About Mark. About how he handled problems. About how often he manipulated situations to protect himself. About an incident years earlier where a mistake had been quietly blamed on someone else. When my attorney told me this, I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. Because I knew something Mark didn't. The truth didn't need me to scream it anymore. It was already moving on its own. My mom called again that night. Her voice was shaking. She said the investigation was getting serious. She said Mark felt betrayed by everyone. She asked if I'd consider coming home so we could present a united front. That phrase almost made me laugh. I told her I needed more time. I told her trust doesn't reset just because it's inconvenient to lose it. I told her I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't willing to lie either. She went quiet. That silence told me everything. By the end of that week, I had allies I never expected. Professionals who believed me. Adults who saw through Mark's act. A version of myself who no longer needed approval from people who had failed him. I wasn't planning revenge the way movies make it look. No dramatic confrontation. No grand reveal yet. I was just making sure that when the moment came, when Mark finally ran out of room to twist the narrative, I would be standing exactly where the truth could reach me. The end didn't come with sirens or shouting. It came quietly, the way real consequences usually do. I was at work when my attorney called. I remember because I almost didn't answer. I'd been trying to train myself not to jump every time my phone buzzed. But something in my chest told me this call was different. He didn't sound excited. He sounded precise. The investigator has concluded their review, he said. They're dropping all charges against you. Fully. No conditions. I leaned against the wall, suddenly aware that my hands were shaking. He let that sink in before continuing. And they're opening a separate inquiry into Mark. That was it. No dramatic pause. No justice speech. Just facts. The official finding was devastating in its simplicity. The brake damage had not only occurred during a window when I wasn't present, but forensic analysis showed tool marks consistent with repeated adjustments. Adjustments made deliberately. Adjustments that aligned with Mark's own documented work on the car after the date he claimed the damage first appeared. In other words, he'd touched the brakes himself. Whether he originally intended to frame me or simply covered a mistake and let the blame land where it was convenient didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he knowingly allowed a false accusation to stand. He pressed charges. He testified. He doubled down. And that made everything else unravel. The former employee's testimony sealed it. Once investigators started pulling Mark's records, they didn't stop at the car. They found inconsistencies in repair logs, questionable billing practices, and a pattern of blaming subordinates for errors that traced back to him. Nothing flashy. Just enough truth, stacked carefully, to destroy the image he'd built his life on. His shop didn't close overnight. But customers stopped coming. Suppliers backed out. An inspection flagged violations he'd been skating past for years. The man who'd always relied on confidence and control suddenly had neither. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell people, "I told you so." I just breathed. The first person to show up at my aunt's house was my mom. She didn't call first. She didn't warn me. She just stood there on the porch, eyes red, hands twisting together like she didn't know what to do with them anymore. For a second, I saw the woman who raised me before fear and convenience rewrote her priorities. She started crying almost immediately. She said she didn't know. She said Mark had convinced her. She said she thought she was protecting the family. She said she never imagined it would go this far. I listened. That was the difference between us. I listened. When she finally ran out of words, she asked the question she'd clearly been building toward the entire time. "Can you forgive me?" I told her the truth. I told her forgiveness wasn't a switch you flip when the consequences finally arrive. I told her she didn't just doubt me, she sacrificed me. That she'd chosen peace in her marriage over safety for her child. That she'd watched me be treated like a criminal and decided it was a lesson worth teaching. She tried to interrupt. I didn't let her. I told her I wasn't angry anymore. That anger had burned out months ago. What was left was clarity. And clarity meant boundaries. I said if she wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be rebuilt slowly, on my terms, with accountability. Not apologies designed to ease her guilt, but actions that showed she understood what she'd done. She nodded. She cried harder. She said she'd do anything. I believed that she believed it. I also knew belief wasn't enough. Mark never came to see me. I heard about his reaction through other people. Rage first, denial, then silence. He told anyone who would listen that he'd been betrayed, that the system was rigged, that I'd manipulated everyone. What he never did was apologize. The formal fallout came a month later. The investigation concluded that he'd made false statements. Charges were recommended. Civil liability followed soon after. My attorney asked if I wanted to pursue damages for wrongful accusation, emotional distress, and loss of income. I said yes. Not because I wanted money. Because I wanted the record to reflect reality. The settlement wasn't massive. It didn't make headlines. But it was enough to say something important in legal language Mark couldn't spin. He was wrong, and I was harmed. By the time everything was finalized, I was no longer the 17-year-old kid sleeping on an air mattress. I had my own small apartment, a steady job, a future that didn't feel like it belonged to someone else anymore. I'd learned how to trust my own instincts again, how to stand still when people tried to rewrite me. My relationship with my mom exists now in a limited, careful way. She checks in. She listens more than she speaks. She doesn't defend Mark anymore. She doesn't ask me to smooth things over. She knows better now. As for Mark, the last I heard, he moved out of state. New town. New story. Same man. Some people never change. They just run out of places to hide. I used to think revenge meant humiliation. Exposure. Watching someone fall the way you did. I was wrong. Revenge was getting my name back. My future back. My sense of self back. Revenge was standing in the truth long enough that the lies collapsed under their own weight. And the most satisfying part? I didn't have to destroy him. I just stopped protecting him from himself. I still remember the sound of the auditorium doors closing behind me that night, not because they were loud, but because no one was on the other side. That's when it finally sank in that I had been holding my breath for weeks for people who were never planning to show up. I'm Nico, I'm 18, and up until that moment, I kept telling myself my family loved me equally. They just had different ways of showing it. I was wrong, and that night was the first time I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I grew up in what everyone on the outside would probably call a good family. 2 parents, a nice house, regular dinners, no shouting matches that neighbors could hear. My dad liked to brag that we were stable, that we didn't have drama like other families. My mom would nod along, smiling, always saying how lucky we were. And for a long time, I believed it. Or maybe I just didn't know what unfairness looked like when it was wrapped in polite words and quiet disappointment. I'm the younger sibling. My brother, Adrian, is 5 years older than me, and from as far back as I can remember, he was the center of gravity in our house. Everything seemed to orbit around him: his school, his sports, his internships, his potential. When Adrian walked into a room, my parents straightened up a little, like they were being evaluated. When I walked in, they'd glance up and ask if I'd finished my homework. It wasn't that they were openly cruel to me. That's what made it confusing. They didn't yell. They didn't insult me outright. They just missed things. My things. A lot. Parent-teacher meetings where my mom forgot the time. Art shows where my dad said parking was too hard. Birthdays that got folded into someone else's schedule because Adrian had something important going on. I learned early not to make a big deal out of it. I learned to shrug and say, "It's fine," even when it wasn't. The thing is, theater was the one place where I felt like I mattered. I wasn't the loudest kid or the most confident, but on stage, I could be someone else. I could be heard. I started acting in middle school, small roles at first, then bigger ones. By high school, it wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was the thing that kept me going. Rehearsals after school, weekends spent memorizing lines, late nights running scenes over and over until my voice went hoarse. I wasn't chasing fame or anything dramatic like that. I just wanted to do something that felt like it belonged to me. My senior year play was different. It wasn't just another production. It was my final one. The last time I'd be on that stage with the same people I'd grown up with. I had a major role, not the lead, but close enough that I was on stage for most of the show. Teachers kept telling us to invite our families. "This is a big one," they said. "You'll remember this forever." I took that to heart. I told my parents about the dates months in advance. I put the flyer on the fridge. I reminded them at dinner. I even wrote the performance dates on our shared family calendar, the one my mom swore by. Every time I brought it up, my mom would smile and say, "Of course we'll be there, honey." My dad would nod and add something like, "Wouldn't miss it." Those words mattered to me more than I wanted to admit. Adrian, meanwhile, had just started climbing the corporate ladder at whatever company he worked for. I never fully understood what his job was, just that it involved emails, meetings, and a lot of talk about opportunities. Everything he did was framed as serious and important. When he called our parents, they'd put him on speaker and listen like he was giving a keynote speech. When I talked about rehearsals, they'd smile politely and ask if I'd considered something more practical for college. A week before opening night, my dad announced at dinner that Adrian had gotten a promotion. He said it like it was a national holiday. My mom clapped her hands together and immediately started talking about celebrating. Adrian wasn't even there, but you would have thought he was sitting at the head of the table. They talked about dinners, reservations, inviting relatives. I sat there quietly, pushing food around my plate, a small knot forming in my stomach. I reminded them, carefully, that opening night was that same week. My mom paused, fork halfway to her mouth, and said, "Oh, right. But that's on Friday, isn't it?" I nodded. She glanced at my dad. They exchanged one of those looks, silent, quick, practiced. My dad said they'd figure it out. That should have been my warning. The day of the performance arrived faster than I expected. I spent the afternoon at school, nerves buzzing under my skin. The cast was energized, everyone talking too fast, laughing too loud. Backstage smelled like dust and makeup and old curtains. I checked my phone more times than I care to admit. No messages. No good luck. No, we're on our way. I texted my mom a simple reminder. Show starts at 7. I'm nervous but excited. She replied 10 minutes later with a heart emoji and, "Break a leg." It wasn't the same as seeing them in the seats, but I told myself it was fine. Maybe they were just running late. As the audience started filing in, I peeked through the curtain. I scanned the rows instinctively, my eyes trained on the spots where my parents usually sat for school events. Empty. I felt a small jolt of panic, quickly buried under the adrenaline of the moment. People are late sometimes, I told myself. Traffic happens. The show began. The lights hit me, and for a while, everything else faded. I delivered my lines, moved through scenes, felt the familiar rush of being completely present. The audience laughed at the right moments, applauded when they were supposed to. From the outside, it probably looked like a great night. Inside, though, I kept counting scenes, kept thinking, maybe they'll come during intermission. Maybe they're just grabbing seats quietly. When intermission came, I rushed backstage and checked my phone again. Still nothing. I texted my dad this time. "Hey, are you guys here?" No reply. The second half of the play felt heavier. I missed a cue I'd never missed before. My hands shook during a scene that was supposed to be calm. I pulled it together because that's what you do on stage, but something had cracked. When the final curtain fell and the audience stood to applaud, I bowed with everyone else, smiling so hard my face hurt. Afterward, the cast met their families in the lobby. Parents hugged their kids, took photos, cried a little. I stood off to the side, holding my costume bag, pretending to be busy on my phone. People asked where my family was. I laughed it off. They couldn't make it, I said, like it was no big deal. It was a big deal. When I finally got home later that night, still in that weird emotional fog, I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. My parents were there, along with Adrian. There were takeout containers on the counter and an open bottle of something expensive my dad saved for special occasions. Adrian was mid-story, talking about his boss, his promotion, his future. They looked happy, relaxed, like they'd just come from something that mattered. My mom noticed me first. "Oh, how was the play?" she asked, genuinely cheerful. I stood there for a second, my heart pounding, my head full of everything I hadn't said for years. I asked, quietly, why they hadn't come. My dad didn't even hesitate. He looked at me like I'd asked something unreasonable and said, "That's different, Nico. This actually matters." The room went silent, and something inside me shifted in a way I knew I wouldn't be able to undo. I didn't say anything right away after my dad dropped those words. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I suddenly had too much. It felt like every small moment I'd brushed off over the years lined up in my head all at once, like receipts I'd never asked for. I stood there, backpack still over one shoulder, makeup half wiped, the smell of stage dust still clinging to me, while my family waited for me to react in a way that wouldn't inconvenience them. My mom tried to smooth it over. She always did. She said something like, "You know what your father means," in that soft voice she used when she wanted things to go back to normal without actually fixing anything. Adrian avoided my eyes, suddenly very interested in his phone. No one apologized. No one even looked uncomfortable. That was the part that hurt the most. This wasn't a mistake to them. It was a decision. I went to my room that night and closed the door quietly, because slamming it would have made things dramatic, and being dramatic was apparently my biggest flaw. I sat on my bed and stared at the wall for a long time. I didn't cry. I felt strangely calm, like something important had finally been clarified. I told myself I wouldn't bring it up again. I told myself I'd stop expecting things. That promise lasted maybe 3 days. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic in the house shifted in small but noticeable ways. Adrian's promotion became the family's favorite topic. Relatives called. My parents retold the story like they'd personally earned the achievement. They framed his success as proof that their parenting worked. Every dinner somehow circled back to Adrian's future, where he might move, how much he might earn, what kind of life he was building. Meanwhile, my college application sat half-finished on my desk, untouched by anyone but me. Whenever I tried to talk about theater, about auditions, scholarships, programs, I got the same responses. "That's nice. Have you thought about a backup? It's good as a hobby." My dad started asking more pointed questions, like whether acting was just a phase or if I planned to grow out of it. My mom suggested I look into something more stable, preferably something that didn't involve all that uncertainty. I started to realize that missing my play wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the most obvious one. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It built slowly, like pressure in a pipe you don't realize is about to burst. It was the way my dad started using Adrian as an example in every conversation. "Your brother understood responsibility early," he'd say. Or, "Adrian didn't waste time on distractions." Sometimes he'd say these things while I was sitting right there, as if I were invisible or too naive to notice the comparison. I tried, for a while, to earn back whatever invisible approval I'd lost. I helped more around the house. I kept my grades up. I stopped talking about theater unless someone asked. I even looked into other majors just to see if anything clicked. Nothing did. The more I bent, the smaller I felt. One afternoon, a few months after the play, my mom asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. That alone made my stomach drop. In our house, sit down meant something serious was coming. My dad was already there, arms crossed, expression neutral in that way that meant he'd already made up his mind. Adrian wasn't home, which should have been a relief, but somehow made it worse. My mom started by saying how proud they were of both of us. That was new. Suspiciously new. She talked about how hard parenting was, how they always tried to do what was best for the family as a whole. I listened, nodding when appropriate, my pulse thudding in my ears. Then my dad leaned forward and said they needed to talk about finances. I didn't see where this was going at first. He explained that with Adrian's new position, there were opportunities, investments, relocations, things that required family support. He said they'd been helping Adrian in small ways already, but now things were getting serious. My mom chimed in, mentioning how expensive the world was, how important it was to invest wisely in the child most likely to succeed. That phrasing stuck with me. The child most likely to succeed. Then they told me they were planning to use the college fund they'd set aside for me to help Adrian relocate closer to his job. It wasn't framed as a question. It was presented like a logical step everyone should understand. My dad said something about returns and long-term benefits. My mom said Adrian would pay them back eventually, once he was settled. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what they were saying. That fund wasn't huge, but it was the one concrete promise I'd held on to. The one thing that made me feel like they believed in my future, even if they didn't always show it. I asked, quietly, what that meant for me. My dad shrugged. You're creative, he said. You'll figure something out. I felt something snap inside my chest. Not explode, snap. Clean and sharp. I told them it wasn't fair. I reminded them that they'd promised that money was for my education. My mom frowned and said I was being selfish, that families made sacrifices for each other. My dad said I was overreacting and that Adrian needed it more right now. I asked them if they'd even talked to Adrian about it. My mom said of course they had. He was uncomfortable at first, apparently, but he understood. That detail hurt more than I expected. He knew. He knew and let it happen. I stopped arguing after that. There was no point. They'd already decided whose future mattered more. After that conversation, I pulled back emotionally in ways I don't think they noticed right away. I stopped sharing details about my life. I stayed late at school. I spent weekends at friends' houses. When my parents talked about Adrian, I listened silently. When they asked me how things were going, I gave vague answers. It wasn't passive-aggressive. It was survival. The real betrayal, the one that changed everything, came a few weeks later, on a day that started completely normal. I came home early from school because rehearsal had been canceled. The house was quiet, which was rare. As I walked past my parents' bedroom, I heard my dad's voice, low and serious, and my mom's softer replies. I wasn't trying to listen, but my name came up, and that made me stop. My dad said something about keeping Nico realistic. My mom replied that they needed to be careful with how they told me. Then my dad said the words that made my stomach drop. If he knows we already signed the papers, he'll make a scene. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. Papers. Signed. Without me. Without even pretending to ask. I realized, in that moment, that missing my play hadn't just been about one night. It had been the start of something much bigger. Something that was already in motion, and I was the only one who hadn't been informed. I backed away slowly, my mind racing, knowing that whatever they'd decided for me, whatever they'd taken without asking, was about to come crashing down on me whether I was ready or not. I didn't confront them right away after overhearing that conversation. I wish I could say it was because I was being strategic or mature, but the truth is simpler and harder to admit. I was scared. Not of yelling or punishment, but of confirmation. Of hearing, out loud, exactly how little space I occupied in their plans. As long as I didn't ask, there was still a tiny part of me that could pretend I'd misunderstood. So I did what I'd always done best. I went quiet. The next few weeks felt like I was moving through fog. I went to school, smiled at the right times, laughed at jokes I barely heard. At home, I stayed in my room more. When my parents talked about logistics or paperwork or Adrian's timeline, I put my headphones on and turned the volume up. Theater, which had always been my escape, suddenly felt complicated. I still loved it, but it also reminded me of everything my family had dismissed. Every rehearsal felt bittersweet, like I was clinging to something already slipping away. The official confirmation came on a Tuesday night, casually, like it was no big deal. We were eating dinner, one of the rare nights Adrian joined us in person. My mom mentioned, almost in passing, that they'd finalized the financial shift to help Adrian move. She said it while passing the salt, like she was talking about switching cable providers. I felt my throat tighten. I asked what she meant by finalized. My dad sighed, like I was exhausting him, and explained that they'd redirected my college fund. Not loaned, not temporarily borrowed. Redirected. The words sounded neat and responsible, like it erased the fact that it had ever been meant for me. He said it was already done, paperwork signed, money allocated. He told me this was a family decision and that I needed to be flexible. I looked at Adrian, waiting, hoping for him to say something, to object, to at least look uncomfortable. He met my eyes for half a second, then looked away. He said quietly, "I didn't ask for this, Nico," which somehow hurt more than if he had. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't even argue. I just stood up, took my plate to the sink, and went back to my room. I locked the door behind me and slid down against it until I was sitting on the floor. That was the moment it hit me fully. I wasn't just overlooked. I was expendable. The fall wasn't dramatic. There was no single night where everything collapsed. It was slower than that, which made it worse. I started sleeping too much or not at all. I skipped meals without meaning to. My grades slipped just enough to draw concern from teachers, but not enough for anyone at home to notice. Theater, once my anchor, started feeling fragile. I worried constantly about the future, about money, about college, about whether I'd made a huge mistake believing I could build a life around something my own family didn't respect. There were nights I stared at my ceiling and wondered if they were right, if I was unrealistic, if I should have been more like Adrian, picked something safe, something impressive, something my parents could brag about. That doubt crept in quietly and made itself comfortable. The lowest point came when I opened my email and saw an acceptance letter from a small performing arts program I'd applied to almost as a long shot. I should have been thrilled. Instead, I felt sick. Tuition numbers swam on the screen. I knew, immediately, that I couldn't afford it. Not without loans. Not without help I no longer had. I sat there for a long time, cursor hovering over the screen, thinking about all the rehearsals, all the nights I'd stayed late perfecting scenes, all the hope I'd poured into something that now felt impossibly far away. I closed my laptop and didn't tell anyone about the acceptance. Not my parents. Not my friends. It felt too painful to say out loud. What pulled me out of that spiral wasn't some grand revelation. It was exhaustion. I got tired of feeling small. Tired of waiting for validation that wasn't coming. One afternoon, while helping clean out old props at the theater, my drama teacher asked me what my plans were after graduation. I gave her the same vague answer I'd been giving everyone else. She studied me for a moment, then said, "You don't sound like someone who's given up. You sound like someone who's been pushed." Something about that stuck. She started talking to me about options I hadn't considered. Scholarships I could apply for independently. Community theater connections. Work-study programs. She didn't sugarcoat how hard it would be, but she also didn't dismiss it as unrealistic. For the first time in months, someone spoke to me like my goals were real. That conversation didn't fix everything overnight, but it lit something small and stubborn inside me. I started researching on my own. Late nights, tabs open across my laptop, spreadsheets of possibilities. I looked into local theater gigs. I applied for grants. I found part-time jobs that fit around rehearsals. It wasn't glamorous. It was slow and uncertain, but it was mine. At home, I kept my plans to myself. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation. My parents didn't ask many questions anyway. They were busy helping Adrian settle into his new life, busy talking about his apartment, his commute, his future. The less they knew about my efforts, the safer they felt. I took a job at a small cafe near campus. It didn't pay much, but it was steady. I saved everything I could. I learned how to budget because I had no other choice. There was something oddly empowering about it. For the first time, my progress wasn't measured against Adrian's milestones. It was measured against yesterday's version of me. The emotional distance between me and my family grew wider, but quieter. There were no more arguments because I stopped trying to be heard. When my dad gave unsolicited advice, I nodded and moved on. When my mom asked about my future in that vague, non-committal way, I said I was figuring things out. Adrian called occasionally, usually to update me on his job. I listened politely, then ended the call early. The rise, when it started, was subtle enough that I almost missed it. It was the moment I realized I wasn't constantly angry anymore. I was focused, busy, tired in a way that felt earned. I started getting small wins, callbacks, positive feedback, opportunities that had nothing to do with my family's approval. Each one felt like proof that I hadn't imagined my potential. Then, one evening, I came home from work to find a large envelope on the kitchen counter with my name on it. My mom was sitting at the table, expression unreadable. My dad stood nearby, arms crossed. The atmosphere felt heavy, deliberate, important. She told me they needed to talk. Again, as I picked up the envelope, I had a sudden, sharp sense that whatever was inside wasn't just information. It was another move in a game I hadn't agreed to play. And this time, I knew I couldn't keep pretending not to notice. I didn't open the envelope right away. I don't know why, but something in me understood that once I did, there would be no going back to pretending. So I held it in my hands for a few seconds longer than necessary, feeling the weight of it, the thickness of the paper inside. My name was written neatly on the front in my mom's handwriting, the same careful script she used for birthday cards and thank you notes. That detail almost made me laugh. My dad cleared his throat. My mom said my name softly, like she was bracing for me to react badly. I finally opened the envelope and slid the contents out onto the table. It was a formal letter, legal-looking, dense with language that took a second to process. Halfway through the first paragraph, my stomach dropped. It wasn't about college. It wasn't an apology. It was a notice. They had refinanced the house. More specifically, they had used the house I grew up in, the one they'd always referred to as the family home, as collateral to help Adrian secure a better loan for a business venture tied to his job. The letter explained the terms in cold, precise detail. Signatures at the bottom confirmed it was already done. I looked up at them slowly. My dad started talking immediately, explaining why this made sense, how it was a strategic move, how Adrian's career trajectory justified the risk. My mom added that this didn't affect me directly, that it was all very safe, very responsible. She said it like she was trying to soothe a child. I asked one question. Just one. I asked what would happen if Adrian's venture didn't work out. There was a pause. Too long. My dad said they didn't expect that to happen. My mom said it was important to be optimistic. Neither of them answered me. That night, I lay awake replaying every conversation I'd had with them over the past year. The missed play, the redirected college fund, the quiet decisions made without me. A pattern emerged that I hadn't wanted to see before. This wasn't favoritism driven by love alone. It was investment. They were betting on Adrian because he fit the version of success they understood. Everything else, including me, was a secondary consideration. For the first time, the anger I felt wasn't sharp or explosive. It was calm, focused, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I asked for copies of everything. Calmly, politely. I said I wanted to understand the family's financial situation, especially if it might affect my future. My dad looked surprised, then vaguely impressed, like I'd finally shown some maturity. He agreed, probably thinking transparency would make me fall in line. He underestimated how observant I'd become. Over the next few weeks, I read everything. Loan agreements, emails, notes scribbled in margins. I didn't understand all of it at first, but I understood enough. Enough to realize how much they'd leveraged, how little margin there was for error, and how dependent the entire plan was on Adrian continuing to succeed without interruption. I also started talking to people. Quietly. My drama teacher put me in touch with a friend of hers who worked in arts administration. That connection led to another, and then another. I learned about contracts, grants, clauses, and contingencies. At the cafe, one of my regular customers turned out to be a retired accountant. We talked casually at first, then more seriously. I asked hypothetical questions. He gave thoughtful answers. Every piece of information felt like a brick. Slowly, I was building something solid under my feet. At home, I didn't change my behavior much. That was intentional. I kept my head down. I stayed polite. I let my parents assume I was still uncertain, still drifting, still the same kid who would eventually need rescuing. Adrian visited occasionally, always busy, always confident. He talked about his projects with enthusiasm. I listened carefully, asked neutral questions, filed away details. The opportunity to shift things came sooner than I expected. One evening, my dad announced that Adrian would be moving again. A bigger role, more responsibility. It was framed as an upgrade, but I caught the tension underneath. My mom started talking about timelines and paperwork. They needed things to move quickly. Certain documents needed signatures. Certain arrangements needed cooperation. That was when my dad looked at me and said they might need my help. I asked how. He said there were some family assets that would be easier to manage if everything was aligned. He said it casually, but I knew what he meant. They wanted my consent, my signature, something that would make their plan smoother and safer. I didn't answer right away. I asked for time to think. That night, I met with my drama teacher and the retired accountant separately. I showed them the documents I was being asked to consider. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough. Both of them reacted the same way, quiet concern, followed by careful questions. They helped me see angles I hadn't fully considered, risks my parents hadn't acknowledged, leverage I didn't realize I had. For the first time, the imbalance of power shifted slightly. I started preparing in earnest. I organized my paperwork. I documented conversations. I kept copies of emails. I made notes after every discussion at home, writing down what was said and by whom. Not out of paranoia, but clarity. I wanted facts, not feelings, to guide me. I also reached out to Adrian directly, not confrontationally. I asked him how he was handling the pressure. I said I knew a lot was riding on his success. He laughed it off at first, then admitted things were more stressful than he'd expected. He didn't go into details, but he didn't need to. I could hear the strain beneath the confidence. When my parents finally sat me down again and asked for my decision, I told them I was willing to help, but only if I fully understood what I was agreeing to. I asked specific questions. I requested revisions. I suggested conditions. They were surprised. My dad looked annoyed. My mom looked nervous. They said I was overcomplicating things. I said I was being careful. The conversation ended without a resolution, but something had changed. They no longer spoke to me like an afterthought. They spoke carefully, measured, like they were negotiating. That night, alone in my room, I laid out everything on my desk, documents, notes, timelines. I could see the entire structure of their plan now, clear as day. I could also see exactly where it was weakest. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do, but I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be decided without me. I didn't spring anything on them right away. If there's one thing theater taught me, it's timing. You don't rush the climax. You let the tension stretch until the audience can't look away. So when my parents asked again for my signature, I said yes. Not immediately, not eagerly. I said yes the way someone says it when they've already made peace with a decision. Calm, reasonable. I told them I'd spoken to a financial advisor through a school connection and that I just wanted one last meeting so everyone was clear on expectations. My dad looked relieved. My mom smiled like she'd finally gotten me back in line. Adrian sent a short text later that night thanking me for being understanding. That message sat on my phone for a long time. The meeting happened on a Saturday afternoon at the dining room table. My parents were there, Adrian joined on video call, and I brought printed copies of everything. Contracts, notes, amendments. My dad seemed impressed by how organized I was. He said something about me finally taking things seriously. I nodded and let him think that. Then I asked to walk through the agreement line by line. At first, it was just clarification. Definitions, timelines, interest rates. I asked questions no one else wanted to linger on. My dad answered confidently, until he couldn't. When I asked what would happen if Adrian's venture underperformed for more than 12 months, there was silence again. Familiar silence. The kind they used to hope I'd ignore. That's when I slid my own document across the table. I told them that if I was being asked to assume risk, direct or indirect, I needed protection. I explained, calmly, that my signature would only come with conditions. If the house was on the line, then so was transparency. If family assets were being leveraged, then all beneficiaries needed clarity. I proposed an amendment. Any future financial support for Adrian would require proportional allocation for me. Education funds, living support, no more figuring it out. My dad's expression hardened. He said that wasn't how families worked. I told him that was exactly how families worked when one child wasn't quietly sacrificed for another. The room changed after that. My mom started wringing her hands. Adrian's face on the screen went tight. He said I was being dramatic. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just kept pointing to the numbers, the risks, the imbalance. I reminded them that my college fund was already gone, redirected without my consent, that this was not a pattern I was willing to continue. My dad said if I didn't sign, I'd be hurting the family. I said if I did sign without safeguards, I'd be hurting myself. Then I did the thing they never expected. I withdrew my consent entirely, not with anger, with a simple sentence. I said I wouldn't be signing anything that day, or any day, unless the terms reflected equal respect and protection. I stood up, gathered my papers, and went to my room. I didn't slam doors. I didn't argue further. I let the silence do the work. What followed was chaos. The next week was a blur of tense dinners, whispered conversations, and frantic phone calls. Adrian's venture hit a snag. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to expose how thin the margin really was. Without my signature, certain refinancing options were off the table. Timelines slipped. Stress mounted. My parents tried everything. Guilt, reason, nostalgia. My mom cried one night, saying she didn't recognize me anymore. My dad accused me of being selfish. Adrian called, frustrated, saying I was making things harder than they needed to be. I listened. I didn't budge. Behind the scenes, I kept building my own life. I accepted a spot in a smaller program with strong connections and flexible costs. I secured a partial scholarship. I lined up work. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. Most importantly, it was mine. The breaking moment came when my dad finally admitted, late one night, that they couldn't sustain the risk they'd taken. The house, their savings, everything hinged on Adrian's continued ascent. He didn't say it as an apology. He said it as a fact. I told him I understood. And then I told him I wouldn't be the safety net they expected. That conversation didn't end well. He said things he couldn't take back. My mom sat quietly, tears streaking down her face. Adrian didn't call for a while after that. The fallout was slow but undeniable. They had to unwind parts of their plan. Sell assets. Downsize expectations. Adrian's venture survived, but barely, and not without consequences. The golden glow around him dulled. For the first time, my parents saw him struggle in a way they couldn't fix with optimism or money. Our relationship didn't recover in the way people like to imagine. There were no grand apologies, no sudden realizations. But something fundamental shifted. They stopped asking me to sacrifice. They stopped assuming my flexibility was infinite. Months later, as I packed for my move, my mom stood in my doorway and asked if I was proud of myself. I told her yes. Not because I'd won, not because anyone else had lost, but because for the first time in my life, I hadn't disappeared to make someone else shine. And when I walked out of that house with my bags, I didn't feel like the child who'd been left behind. I felt like someone who finally mattered to himself.